100 years ago, the proud antlers and imposing bearing of Roosevelt elk in British Columbia were a rare sight. But thanks to dedicated conservation efforts and translocation, Roosevelt elk are now rebounding in areas where the habitat is suitable and the potential for conflict with people is low.
Without the province doing what they need, their flights, doing their counts, seeing that there was a decrease and coming up with a plan to relocate elk from Mid-Island to North Island, there would probably be very minimal, if any, elk left on the North Island. So the project that started years and years ago, relocating them, has flourished.
Roosevelt elk are the largest of the 4 subspecies of elk in North America. Adult male Roosevelt elk weigh up to 1,100 pounds and can live around 12 to 15 years. They inhabit the temperate rainforests of western North America, extending from northern California to southern British Columbia. In BC, they are distributed throughout most of Vancouver Island and on the southern mainland coast. Roosevelt elk are native to BC and Vancouver Island, which means they have naturally evolved in this area and are not an introduced species.
Uathluk is taking care of them, and that's our ability to help steward the lands and the population and make sure that we keep them safe and keep them protected. And then Itzhak is respect for all things and respect for nature. Being able to understand the importance of having Tlunum in the system, and then the responsibility that we have. When I think of things and I see things, I'm trying to understand in the future, because my ancestors and my elders taught me that we are not thinking about us, we're thinking about the future generations. So the effects that we might have now far outweigh, or they're nothing in compared to the benefit that can happen in the future.
Roosevelt elk serve an important ecological role in coastal ecosystems. They influence plant types and growing patterns in their preferred habitats. They are also food for predators like wolves, cougars, and bears. They are valued by local Indigenous peoples for food, social, and ceremonial reasons, and they play an important economic and social role for licensed hunters and wildlife viewers.
The neutronal principles, I can speak to 3 of them. Everything's interconnected. Some of the pieces that we're missing, we're having them out of the system, the movement of the nutrients throughout the system, where it was on land and then interspersed into the creeks, and then it goes into the fish, and then the bears carry the fish back up into the forest, and you get that cyclical system that happens.
Quatsina would not be able to harvest their elk each year that supplies the food security to our elders and our community.
They are classified as a species of special concern in BC because they are sensitive to natural or human-caused disturbance, such as extreme winter weather, resource extraction, development, and overharvest. By the late 1800s, elk abundance had substantially declined due to increased harvest levels and habitat loss from increased human activity. Their current distribution is smaller and more fragmented than in the early 1800s, and natural dispersal has been slow. Conservation efforts since then have had a positive impact, and in some areas, elk abundance has grown significantly thanks in part to translocation projects. In other areas, elk are still absent or rare throughout their historic range. These translocation projects are important because they help to increase small elk populations in areas that can support more elk to build sustainable harvest opportunities. There needs to be more than 50 elk in a population unit so that harvest does not affect the herd's growth and ability to withstand hard winters, diseases, and predation.
They were almost wiped out years and years ago due to over harvesting, and then we started relocating from other areas of the island and bringing them to the North Island. I know, because I've watched those herds the last 15-20 years, that they've grown quite a bit and have split off into their own little herds, which, you know, after they hit about 50 per herd, you can kind of start harvesting from those herds individually. The elk that they relocated as well, they were close to the highways where there were few being hit by vehicles.
On Vancouver Island, elk tend to inhabit wide river valley bottoms. Many of these areas also make ideal agricultural lands for farming. Elk likely thrive in these modified landscapes because they can find their natural preferred food as well as farmed, high-quality food. They are also safer since predators tend to avoid areas of human activity and hunting pressure is low. Some of these areas overlap with highways, creating public safety hazards when elk cross busy highways and risk causing a collision with fast-moving vehicles. There are two strategies available to wildlife managers to reduce these conflicts. Offer increased hunting opportunities for First Nations and licensed hunters, which can provide some help, and translocate a group of elk to a place where elk are needed and are unlikely to come into conflict. More than 30 translocations have occurred on Vancouver Island since 1978. Moving elk to the Sunshine Coast began in 1987. As of 2022, more than 300 elk have been moved on Vancouver Island, and more than 600 elk have been moved along the mainland of southern coastal BC. It takes at least 5 years for a translocated herd to reach 50 animals after they've been moved. When this threshold is reached, sustainable harvest opportunities may be considered. Here's how translocation works. Step 1. Provincial biologists work with First Nations to identify a group of elk in a high-conflict area and gain support for a translocation. Elk from these high-conflict areas are called the source herd. Step 2. Provincial biologists also work with First Nations to determine a suitable release location. Step 3. A large enclosure trap or corral is built and baited with high-quality elk food. The bait is replenished frequently so the elk get used to eating undisturbed in the same spot. Remote cameras are used to determine which elk are using the trap site. Step 4. Once enough elk are in the trap, the door is closed. The elk are loaded into a livestock truck and driven to the release site. Step 5. A few cow elk are fitted with GPS tracking collars so they can be monitored in their new habitat. Step 6. The elk are then released from the truck.
They got to the point where they could see around the corner and far enough away where they felt comfortable with us, and they all stopped all at once and they started smelling, and they're such large, beautiful creatures that they started smelling, and they could see the steam, their vapor going up into the air, and they could smell where they were. It was quite magical to see that moment, you know. Get emotional thinking about it again. It was powerful to be there.
Without the support of the First Nations organizations to relocate some of the elk in their traditional territory to the North Island, our elk population wouldn't be where it's at today.
I'd like to take the opportunity to say Kleko, Kleko, and raise my hands to the nations that were so kind as to share their Tlunum with our people and our future generations. Thank you, because their ability to steward and to take care of and harvest Tlunum in the future is a gift that you've given them, and really appreciate it.
Translocating elk is a government-led initiative that requires a huge group effort and many helping hands to make it a success. Partnerships with First Nations in both the source and release locations are vitally important.
Management of wildlife is a large responsibility, and there's so many factors that feed into it that it's going to take all of us working together to be able to manage it. So if we didn't have translocation, we wouldn't have Tlunum in there.
Translocation projects also partner closely with community organizations and stakeholders. These partnerships are key to conserving BC's wildlife.